The View from Saturday, Chapter 9. The Commissioner of Education, recovered from the shock of having a contestant protest a ruling, cited Julian. He took away the 2 points he had been given for answering half of the question and gave Maxwell a chance to answer. The 2 acronyms they gave were MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Julian was about to protest that answer on the basis that MAD was not a true acronym because it was a word even before it became an acronym. But the word itself was spelled with 1 D, not 2, so Julian, who was patient beyond his years, said nothing and waited. Maxwell next came up with sonar. While waiting for them to decide what sonar stood for, one of the panel experts looked up from a heavy volume and sent a signal to the commissioner. He walked over to her. When he returned to the lectern, he said, "We have an adjustment to make on the score. TIP is an acronym for to ensure promptness. We restore the 5 points we subtracted as penalty and add 4 for answering the question. Maxwell will be allowed to retain 2 points for MAD, but will not receive credit for sonar." Julian said, "Thank you, sir." No one dared applaud, but everyone in the row to the left of Mrs. Olinsky sported smiles that were very loud. And in the row behind her, Nate and Sadie, Izzy and Margie sat on their hands. Even Margie got that excited. Between their regional championship and their trip to Albany, word had gotten out that something unusual was happening in Epiphany. Mrs. Lawrenson had made a call to the local newspaper, and Mrs. Olinsky and the Souls were featured above the fold on the first page of the Metro section of the Epiphany Times. That started the blitz of publicity to which Dr. Roy Clayton Romer happily surrendered. He hungered for positive taxpayer feedback, so he called a press conference. After Holly Blackwell, the popular anchorwoman of Channel 3 Eyewitness News, accepted his invitation, he invited Mrs. Olinsky, the Souls, Mrs. Lawrenson, and Mr. Homer Fairbairn to attend. While arranging the Souls behind Dr. Romer like a backdrop of the American flag, Holly Blackwell pointed the microphone at Nadia and, pitching her voice a full octave higher than her on-air voice, said, "And where did you get all these beautiful red curls?" Nadia looked around. "We?" she asked. "Does someone else have red hair?" Whereupon Holly Blackwell turned her back on all the Souls and instructed the cameraman to pan across their faces occasionally, but not to focus on Dr. Romer. Mrs. Olinsky was not pleased. Here were 4 kids who could speak in complete sentences without a single as filler, and Holly Blackwell asked them nothing. She asked Mrs. Olinsky one question. Guess what it was? How did she choose her team? Mrs. Olinsky gave one of her good answers, her complimentary skills response, dressing it up to say that the team's talents blended like a chorus, making one sound out of many voices. But her answer ended up on the cutting room floor. Dr. Homer Fairbairn was under orders to smile a lot and say nothing except, "The taxpayers are very proud." He asked Dr. Romer if he could say, "We are very proud of these youngsters." No, just the taxpayers are very proud. How about, "Everyone is very proud of this team"? No, just the taxpayers are very proud. And smile. Smile for Holly, the camera, and the sake of education. So the session was almost over when Holly Blackwell tilted her coif and turned her baby blues on the deputy superintendent and asked him how the trip to Albany would be financed. Homer Fairbairn smiled and replied, "The taxpayers are very proud." Dr. Romer grew as pale as a paper of an unsigned contract. Having followed orders, Mr. Fairbairn only provided the only real news that came out of the news conference. Mrs. Lawrenson immediately called the school bus dispatcher and reserved 6 big yellow ones to take the Epiphany boosters to Albany. Dr. Romer said that the taxpayers were very proud, but not that proud. He said that unlike football matches, where he could charge admission to the games, there was no precedent for charging admission to the academic bowl. Taxpayer money would pay Mrs. Olinsky's expenses and the Souls, would even pay Mrs. Lawrenson's and, of course, his own, but he could not pay for chartered buses to take the entire town of Epiphany to Albany. He would allow the buses to be used, but he would not pay for the gas or the driver. And that was when Century Village came through. Noah's mother had taped the press conference and sent it to Noah's Grandma Sadie and Grandpa Nate, who in turn shared it with everyone in the clubhouse at Century Village. They commissioned Bella Dubinsky to design a t-shirt. At the suggestion of Mrs. Froelich, she drew a noose. Nothing else. Sadie Gershom suggested that she put the name of the school under that. Bella refused. "Less is more," she said. "Not if it wins over losses," Sadie answered. But she liked the design after all, and they arranged to have it silk-screened on 500 red t-shirts, which they shipped north. They sold for $10 apiece, and the profit paid for the gas for the buses. The drivers donated their services. Mrs. Olinsky drove to Albany, taking Julian and Mr. Singh with her. Chapter 10. The judges adjusted the score for the acronym question, which put Epiphany ahead. Then Maxwell answered, "Who was the first president to live in the White House?" And the score was even. Then Epiphany answered, "What is the waste product of photosynthesis?" Maxwell answered the 3 major food groups, and Epiphany answered, "Who was the first Spanish explorer to reach Florida?" The lead ping-ponged back and forth as the teams took turns answering. Mr. Singh said, "You are a very good driver, Mrs. Olinsky." The rhythm of his speech was something between a chant and a bird call. "I have not myself a high degree of skill for driving automobiles. For many years we lived on a cruise ship, and I was so fully mature a man before I passed my first driving test. Did you require many lessons to learn how to drive a handicapped vehicle?" "I had a few," Mrs. Olinsky replied. They rode in silence, listening only to the muffled thump and whir of the tires riding over the interstate, before Mrs. Olinsky added, "After my accident, it took more courage to get back into the passenger side of an automobile than it took for me to learn to drive again." "I can understand that," Mr. Singh replied. "It often takes more courage to be a passenger than a driver. Of course, Mrs. Olinsky, I am in no way making reference to this trip." Julian sat alone in the back seat and read the trees and houses and road signs. He said almost nothing, but Mrs. Olinsky was never not aware of him. Finally, she said, "Julian makes each mile a journey of 1/4 inches." Mr. Singh replied, "It is a skill he learned when we lived on the cruise ship, Mrs. Olinsky. He learned to be a passenger. He learned to read the ocean by the cupful. He also learned to regard each port of call as part of the journey and not as destination. Every voyage begins when you do." "When you fill your pen," Mrs. Olinsky said. Mr. Singh smiled. "Yes, Noah told us." Suspense grew, and the commissioner did his best to sustain it. He took his time between questions. He looked over at the judges, nodded, reached into the bowl, and slowly unfolded the paper. "This question is Maxwell's." Everyone knew that. Maxwell should have to answer correctly to tie it up again. The commissioner tugged ever so gently at his French cuff. He adjusted his glasses. He cleared his throat. He read, "In what work of fiction would we meet the original Humpty Dumpty, and who wrote it?" The answer came, "Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by—" "No," said the Commissioner of Education before they could supply an answer to the second part and throw the judges into a panic about the possibility of having to award Maxwell half credit and create confusion about the score. There was an audible gasp from the audience. Didn't they all believe, those who had actually read Alice and not just said that they had, that Humpty Dumpty came from Wonderland? Because Mrs. Olinsky heard Grandpa Nate Gershom. Behind her, Mrs. Olinsky heard Grandpa Nate Gershom whisper to Grandma Sadie, "I think it's Mother Goose. Logic tells me that an egg would come from a mother and a goose." The Commissioner of Education tapped on his microphone and demanded quiet. While the audience waited, he took his Mark Cross pen from his inside jacket pocket and wrote on the back of the question in question, "To be discussed. The use of compound questions for match point." He replaced his pen in his inside jacket pocket, turned to his right, and asked, "Epiphany, can you answer?" Nadia, Noah, Ethan looked at Julian, inviting him to give the correct answer. "Through the Looking Glass" by Lewis Carroll. It was match point. Epiphany must answer a follow-up to be declared the winner. The commissioner looked again at the paper in his hand. Several spaces beneath and printed in italics was the follow-up. What was the true name and occupation of the author? Julian knew. Reverend Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, math teacher, Oxford University. It was over. Between reality and realization, there was a pause. It was over. There was a beat, time for hearts to skip. There was a gap, time for hearts and minds to connect. There was a moment for joy to find its home. It was over, and Epiphany had won. The Maxwell side of the room was the first to clap. Epiphany the first to cheer. The team from Maxwell walked over to the Souls, shook their hands as they had been taught to do, and smiled the parched way that losers do. The Souls smiled triumphantly at the audience and for the cameras. There must have been 100 cameras flashing and whirring with spots dancing in their eyes. They walked to the edge of the small stage and stood in front of Mrs. Olinsky and applauded her specifically until everyone else got the message and stood and faced her and applauded too. Mrs. Olinsky smiled and said thank you, and smiled and nodded and said thank you, over and over again, wheeling her chair in small circles until her smile and her words floated like a frisee around the room. The souls came down from the stage then, and 2 by 2 stood on either side of her wheelchair. So the commissioner had to come down off the stage to give them their trophy. They didn't want it unless Mrs. Olinsky was there with them. And the souls of Mrs. Olinsky shared the trophy that is called a loving cup. And it was. And then it was all over.